Hallo zusammen! Of course, a band like Rammstein is more than the sum of its parts. But, of course, the several different parts make the band sound. If one member were to change, or if one member were substituted, the sound would change. And that's why today I want to focus on Richard Z. Kruspe, one of the two guitarists in the band, his upbringing in the former GDR, and how he found his way into the metal scene and into Rammstein, essentially. So, let's find out. You may have noticed me pronouncing the name maybe quite differently to what you are used to saying. The German verbalization of this name is Richard, with a light sounding ch, Richard. Z, das Z, the letter Z or Z, and Kruspe, which always sort of reminds me of the German noun die Kruste, singular. Die Krusten, plural, even though it doesn't have anything to do with that, but you know, Richard Z. Krust. Almost sounds like a character out of SpongeBob. To be precise though, you'd actually have to call him Sven, with a pretty sharp S at the beginning. Sven, because actually that's his real birth name. Sven Kruspe was born on June 24th, 1967 in the small town Wittenberge in the state of Brandenburg, which back then was part of the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, aka Deutsche Demokratische Republik, the official German name abbreviated DDR, also colloquially known as East Germany in English. The socialist communist state existed from 1949 until 1990, when both Germanies, West and East, reunited to the Germany we know today. If you want to find out more about this, you can watch my video on October the 3rd, which is Germany's national holiday, the former two Germanys, East and West, and the German reunification. You can find a link to that video in the end card. Up until the age of 12, Richard had a quite peaceful, normal childhood. While he was still living in Wittenberge, he enjoyed wrestling in a town's club, but also became increasingly interested in music. When he became a teen, and he increasingly reflected on the way his life was organized back then, his life changed. A big part of that was die Scheidung, the divorce of his parents, which eventually led to the family moving to Schwerin in northern Germany, which was still part of the GDR. You have to keep in mind that back in the day, as an ordinary GDR citizen, you couldn't just leave the GDR like that, you know, it wasn't possible. However, he didn't really get along too well with his Stiefvater, the stepfather, which also increased his urge to rebel against his own life back then. Another good example of his growing rebellious, more individualist behavior, some, including himself, may even call it naive, and sorglos, carefree, can be found in something which sounds totally normal from today's point of view, but back then it simply wasn't. In the GDR, musicians had to have a so-called Spielerlaubnis, an admission to play music, in order to be allowed to play music publicly. One of the reasons for this was that the GDR regime didn't want musicians to sing against the core values of the communist state, let alone evoke a riot or misinfluence the youth in that regard. Richard neglected those regulations and played punk rock music without that permission. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be punk rock, I guess. Another factor that may as well have contributed to his quite rebellious attitude is the fact that Sven, aka Richard, was born as the second child into family Kruspe, which in consequence also gave Richard the freedom to follow his own interests even more. So in order to basically separate himself from the good brother, he sort of became the bad brother. As a consequence, his parents often gave him der Stubenarrest, meaning he had to stay at home. It's also known as der Hausarrest, the house arrest, so to speak, quite literally actually. And sitting in his small room, his only way to mentally escape the situation and life in the GDR was listening to foreign rock or metal music, classic bands of the era, such as Black Sabbath or AC/DC. In some way, you may even be able to argue that these situations have contributed to his intrinsic will to play music, see the world, leave the GDR behind. In a way, without him having been born second, and the GDR life may have led him to pursue a different career all along, who knows? It's an interesting thought though, which by no means of course is supposed to downplay the dictatorship of the GDR, of course. As he got older, he worked as der Koch, the chef. And next to that, he also created jewelry, which wasn't really allowed back then though. Through a spy, the Stasi, die Staatssicherheit, the GDR regime police, got word of it and told Richard that either he would basically have to join them or else he had to go to jail. Hooray. Richard was given 1 week of deliberation and of course he wasn't allowed to tell anybody since he could technically have ended up working as a spy. But because he told pretty much every friend he knew, he actually tricked the Stasi and got away with it. Lucky bastard. He later mentioned that he never found out which of his friends actually spied on him, but he wasn't particularly interested in finding out anyway. During his childhood, he really loved to play the guitar and increasingly became better at it. And one of his first bands he played in from 1987 to 1989 was actually called Das Elegante Chaos, the Elegant Chaos. In October of 1989, the 22-year-old Richard indeed saw no other way than fleeing, escaping the communist regime in order to live an unconstrained life as a musician. He eventually managed to flee to West Germany, but because of the wall and the strict and even life-threatening measures guards would use or take against GDR citizens who wanted to escape the GDR and get behind the wall, many were even shot to death there. He first traveled to the Czech Republic, then to Hungary, and then he found a way to emigrate from the GDR to West Germany. See what I did there? I guess you could argue that his first emigration was as much of an influence on his solo band name that is, as his second one to New York. When the wall had come down in 1989 and the GDR had ceased to exist in 1990, he returned to Schwerin, former GDR territory, and continued to play in a band called Das Auge Gottes, the Eye of God. At that time, in the early 90s, he also got to know someone called Till Lindemann, who was playing drums in the band First Arsch, First Ass. Interesting band name. They were looking for a new guitarist and, long story short, Richard eventually joined the group. From 1991 onwards, he also played in the band Die Firma, The Company, and that's when he also got to know their drummer Christoph Schneider. Now a part of the music scene in the reunited Germany, he got to know fellow musicians easier than it may have been possible in the GDR, also because of the aforementioned required Spielerlaubnis. Back in GDR days, sitting in his room, music was one of the only ways Richard Z. Kruspe could get an impression on the rest of the world behind the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain. He had the chance to listen to US-American rock and metal, which he fell in love with, so he wanted to experience that music live, and now he actually had the chance to experience that music live with his own eyes and ears for the first time. So in the early 90s, he, his new friend Till Lindemann, and a certain bass player of the befriended tongue-twister-like band The Instructables, Oliver Riedl, traveled to the USA for the first time. Probably also their first official vacation outside of East Germany or Europe. At the time, Richard Z. Kruspe was playing in a crossover band with the iconic name Orgasm Death Gimmick, up until 1993. But longing for a new musical outlet, he and his, by then, roommates Oliver Riedl and Christoph Schneider joined forces with Till Lindemann and founded a new band. No, not Rammstein yet, but Temple Prayers, which is a pretty cool name. A huge early influence in their style was Pantera, for instance. And interestingly enough, even though Paul Landers and Christoph Schneider already knew each other by then, because of their former band Feeling B, Landers wasn't part of the Temple Prayers at first. After a pretty successful participation in a Berlin-based music context, the four-piece became a five-piece, with the addition of Paul Landers and, later on also, sort of, with Christian Lorenz, also known as Flake, and on January the 1st, 1994, the band Rammstein was born. At first, the guest keyboard player Christian Lorenz, who was formerly playing in Feeling B as well, wasn't the biggest fan of the band's style, but since he knew the guys, he would do them a favor and play music with them for a while. And I guess it was still much fun for him. One of his ideas was to have German lyrics. So, in a way, in hindsight, Christian Lorenz, aka Flake, basically laid a massive foundation in terms of the band's further success and popularity worldwide, despite, or maybe because, of the German lyrics. Dark vocals, heavy riffs, keyboard licks, and steady drum grooves, all of which is an integral part of the music of Rammstein. And if you want to find out more about Till Lindemann and his life before Rammstein, before fame, so to speak, you can watch that video right here, linked in the end cards. Thank you all so very much for supporting my channel and my work on YouTube. Believe me, it's greatly appreciated. So thanks for watching, everyone. I'm your Vlog Dave. Tschüss und bis zum nächsten Mal.